The air in the dimly lit room was thick with anticipation as Bumpy Johnson sat across from one of the most powerful men in New York, Lucky Luciano, a name that sent shivers down the spines of anyone who knew the underworld. The legendary crime boss, dressed in his usual tailored suit, leaned back in his chair, his cold eyes never leaving Bumpy's face. "You know what I'm offering, Bumpy," Luciano said, his voice smooth but with an underlying threat that was impossible to ignore. "The city's at a crossroads. Times are changing. You either join forces with me or you risk everything." Bumpy didn't flinch. His reputation had been built on defiance, on standing tall in the face of threats. And in that moment, it was clear that this wasn't just a conversation about money or territory. It was about power, about the future of Harlem. Bumpy's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. He'd heard rumors of this meeting, the whispers in the underworld about Luciano's ambitions. And while some might have feared what the Mafia could bring, Bumpy Johnson had never been a man to bow to anyone. "You think you can come into my city and tell me what to do?" Bumpy's voice was low, yet firm as he leaned forward, locking eyes with Luciano. The table between them felt like a chasm, but the challenge was clear. The stakes were high. Bumpy had carved out his empire in Harlem, controlling the streets, the businesses, and the respect of its people. Luciano, on the other hand, ruled a vast network that stretched across New York City and beyond. This wasn't just about survival. It was about which man would control the future. The tension hung in the air, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. For Bumpy, this was no ordinary deal. It was a test, a challenge to his authority, to his control. But there was more at play than just business. Harlem wasn't just a piece of land. It was a community, a legacy. And Bumpy wasn't about to let anyone, not even Luciano, take that from him. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a man. He was an institution. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, he moved to Harlem in search of a better life, only to find that survival on the streets was a battle of its own. But where others saw danger, Bumpy saw opportunity. He built his reputation from the ground up, rising from a small-time hustler to the king of Harlem's criminal underworld. By 1934, Bumpy had achieved the kind of power that most men could only dream of. Harlem was his turf, his kingdom. His influence was undeniable. He controlled the flow of drugs, bootlegging, and gambling, making him one of the most feared men in New York. But what set Bumpy apart wasn't just his criminal empire. It was his respect. He was feared by many, but loved by those who lived in Harlem. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a protector, a leader who understood that loyalty, not violence, was the true key to power. But the world around him was changing. The Great Depression had left its mark on the streets of New York, and the Mafia, under the leadership of men like Lucky Luciano, had begun to grow in strength. The old ways of doing business were being challenged by new forces, and the once unquestioned dominance of men like Bumpy was starting to be threatened. The Gambino family, the Genovese family, and others had begun to make moves into Harlem, testing the waters to see if Bumpy was still as strong as his reputation. While some saw this as an opportunity for expansion, Bumpy saw it as a direct challenge to his authority. He had spent years building his empire, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him, especially not a man like Lucky Luciano, whose ambition knew no bounds. And so, in the midst of this shifting power dynamic, Bumpy found himself facing an unexpected proposition. Luciano's offer was simple, but dangerous. Join forces and share the spoils, or risk losing everything. To Bumpy, the answer was clear. Harlem was his, and no one, not even Luciano, would take it from him without a fight. But Bumpy was no fool. He understood the stakes, and he knew that any decision he made could change the future of Harlem and his legacy forever. The first sign that Luciano's influence was beginning to encroach on Harlem came in the form of a quiet visit. A man named Joe Adonis, a member of Luciano's inner circle, arrived in the neighborhood one evening, bringing with him an unsettling message. "Luciano wants a piece," Joe said bluntly as he sat down with Bumpy at a back table in one of Harlem's most trusted bars. "Not just the streets, Bumpy. He wants a partnership. You, me, and Luciano. Together we control everything." Bumpy took a long drag from his cigarette, his eyes narrowing as he listened. He had heard rumors of Luciano's ambitions, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel all the more real. The Mafia was making its move, and Bumpy knew that if he didn't act, he could lose everything he had worked for. "What makes you think I'll just hand over my city?" Bumpy's voice was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes. The power dynamic had already shifted. Bumpy had to act fast. Joe leaned back in his chair, sensing the tension in the room. "Luciano's got bigger plans, Bumpy. He's got connections, muscle, and more money than you've ever seen. He's not asking for permission. He's making an offer you can't refuse." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, but Bumpy didn't budge. He had always relied on his instincts, and they told him that this wasn't just about money. It was about respect. Harlem was his kingdom, and no one was going to come in and take it without a fight. But Bumpy knew this was a delicate game. The Mafia was powerful, and they had the resources to back up their threats. If he fought them head-on, there was a chance he could lose everything: his empire, his reputation, his life. But if he played his cards right, there was a way to come out on top. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat in silence, weighing his options. He had always been a man of action, but now he was faced with a decision that required more than just strength. It required strategy. "Tell Luciano I'll consider his offer," Bumpy finally said, his voice steady. "But know this: I don't play by anyone else's rules. Not now. Not ever." Joe's eyes narrowed, sensing the challenge in Bumpy's words. He stood up to leave, but not before offering one final loaded statement. "Luciano doesn't like to be kept waiting." As the door slammed shut behind Joe, Bumpy remained seated, his mind already racing with the possibilities. He had never been one to back down from a fight. But this wasn't just about fighting. It was about survival. Harlem's future was on the line, and Bumpy Johnson wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. Days passed, and the tension in Harlem thickened like a storm on the horizon. Bumpy Johnson knew the Gambino family had been making moves, expanding their influence in ways that threatened everything he had built. The more he thought about Luciano's offer, the more he realized how dangerous this was. It wasn't just about the Mafia muscling in on his territory. It was about them trying to rewrite the rules of the game, and Bumpy wasn't the type to let anyone change the game. His first course of action was to call his closest men, the ones who had stood by him through thick and thin. He needed their loyalty more than ever. Harlem wasn't just a place, it was a brotherhood, a community that depended on him for leadership and protection. And while the Mafia could throw money, threats, and muscle around, it was the heart of Harlem that made Bumpy's empire unshakable. "Listen up," Bumpy began as he gathered his men in a back room at a club he controlled. His voice was calm but carried the weight of someone who understood the stakes. "Luciano thinks he can buy his way into Harlem. He thinks I'll just roll over and hand him the streets. But that's not how this works." Big Jim, one of Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants, nodded in agreement. "We've been with you since the start, Bumpy. Ain't no way we're letting them in. But what's the play?" Bumpy leaned forward, his fingers tapping the table as he considered the question. He wasn't one to rush into decisions. If he was going to make his move, it had to be calculated, precise. Luciano's got muscle, he's got cash, but what he doesn't have is Harlem's respect. And that's what's going to make the difference. We don't need to fight him head on, we need to make him understand what he's really up against. The room was silent as his men processed the plan. Bumpy's reputation as a strategist was well known. He didn't just run the streets, he understood the game better than anyone. It was clear to them that he was already steps ahead of Luciano. The Gambino family may have had the resources, but Bumpy had something even more valuable: control over Harlem's heart. "We're not going to make this about brute force," Bumpy continued, his voice steady. "We'll keep pushing back, bit by bit. We'll let Luciano think he's winning, but we'll pull the strings. We control the businesses, the politicians, the streets. Luciano can't have what we've built, not without paying a price. And I'm not talking money." Big Jim raised an eyebrow, understanding exactly where Bumpy was going. "You're talking about making him pay with respect." Bumpy nodded. "Exactly. We're going to make Luciano understand that he can't just walk in and take what's ours. We'll make him earn it piece by piece until he realizes that he's dealing with something bigger than just another mafia boss. He's dealing with Harlem. And Harlem don't bow to anyone." The confrontation finally came to a head on a rainy night in 1934. It wasn't a dramatic, gun-toting shootout that the movies would later depict. No, Bumpy Johnson wasn't the type to make a spectacle of himself. Instead, it happened quietly, behind the scenes, where the true power of Harlem lay. Bumpy had arranged a meeting with Luciano, a chance for both men to face each other directly. It was set to take place in one of the more neutral locations in the city, a speakeasy that catered to high-profile figures from all walks of life. But Bumpy wasn't just showing up to discuss business, he was showing up to set a precedent. When Bumpy arrived, the usual hush of respect swept through the room. Everyone in attendance understood who ruled Harlem. But this wasn't about the room's whispers, it was about the man sitting across from him. Luciano was there, his usual calm confidence replaced with an edge of frustration. He had expected this meeting to be another simple negotiation, another step toward tightening his grip on the city. What he got instead was a reminder that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another player in the game. He was the one who held the cards. "You asked for this meeting, Bumpy," Luciano said, his voice cold, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of annoyance. "What's it going to take for you to see reason? You can't fight me forever." Bumpy, calm and unwavering, leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Luciano. "I'm not here to fight you, Lucky. I'm here to remind you of something." He paused, letting the silence settle between them. "This city, this street, this world, Harlem, it's mine. You think you can come in here and take control, but it doesn't work like that. Not with me, not with my people." Luciano's face darkened, his usual smirk replaced by a thin line. "You're out of your depth, Bumpy. I have the resources to crush you. My reach extends far beyond Harlem." Bumpy's smile never faltered. "I don't care how far your reach goes. Harlem's not for sale. And I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for the people who've put their trust in me. You walk into Harlem, you're not just facing a man. You're facing a community that won't back down." For a long moment, Luciano didn't respond. The tension in the room was so thick that it felt like the very air was holding its breath. Finally, Luciano spoke, his voice laced with reluctant acknowledgement. "Then what do you want, Bumpy?" Bumpy's smile widened, but it wasn't an expression of joy. It was a smile born of knowing exactly how the game would end. "I don't want your money, Luciano. I don't want your power. What I want is simple. You respect Harlem. You respect me. And if you can do that, we won't have a problem. But if you push, if you try to take what's mine, you'll regret it." Luciano stared at Bumpy, his gaze unwavering. It was clear that Bumpy had won this round. The balance of power had shifted once again, but this time, Luciano knew he wasn't facing a thug. He was facing a legend. The tension in the room was palpable as Bumpy Johnson sat back, his arms crossed, waiting for Luciano to respond. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Luciano's gaze was cold, calculating. His mind raced, weighing the cost of pushing back against Bumpy, against Harlem, versus the potential rewards of continuing to challenge the man who ruled the streets. Luciano had built an empire, but he knew well enough that Harlem wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was a symbol, a place where men who had nothing could build everything. And Bumpy wasn't just a man, he was the heart of that world. Luciano's silence spoke volumes. He wasn't ready to make a move just yet. But he knew, as Bumpy did, that this was only a temporary truce, a moment in time before the real battle would begin. "All right, Bumpy," Luciano said, his voice tinged with grudging respect. "I'll respect your terms, for now, but understand this. I don't make deals like this often. You're lucky you've got something I can't ignore. But don't think this is over." Bumpy nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Luciano's. "I never said it was over. I said you'll respect Harlem." He leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "And if you step out of line again, Luciano, you'll find out why Harlem doesn't bend. You're not the first to try, and you won't be the last." With that, Bumpy stood up, the weight of his authority undeniable. He turned toward the door, signaling for his men to follow. Luciano, though clearly dissatisfied with the situation, remained seated, watching Bumpy's retreating figure. It was the first time in years that Luciano had been forced to back down from a confrontation in such a manner, and the implications of this moment would follow him for a long time. The aftermath of the meeting rippled through both worlds. On the streets of Harlem, Bumpy's men had already begun making moves, reasserting control over businesses and keeping a keen eye on every inch of the territory that had once been threatened. The word quickly spread that Bumpy Johnson had successfully held his ground, and the respect he had earned among his people grew tenfold. They had seen firsthand what it meant to challenge their king, and they had seen the price that came with it. Across town, Luciano's men began to feel the weight of the loss. While Bumpy's victory wasn't a spectacle, it was a decisive one. Luciano had learned that even the most powerful families could be humbled if they didn't respect the territories they entered. And for Bumpy, this wasn't just about winning a negotiation. It was about asserting his dominance, proving once again that Harlem wasn't for sale. There was no bloodshed, no dramatic shootout in the streets. But in the quiet aftermath of that meeting, Bumpy had sent a message to the Mafia. Harlem was untouchable, and he was the one who held the keys. The events of that night in 1934 would become one of the defining moments in Bumpy Johnson's legend. It wasn't a fight won with guns or violence, but with something far more powerful: respect. Bumpy's victory over Lucky Luciano marked a shift in the balance of power in New York, and it solidified Bumpy's place not just as a figurehead of Harlem's streets, but as a symbol of the indomitable will of the people who lived there. Harlem had always been more than a place. It was a heartbeat, a community of survivors who had fought for their place in a world that had never given them a chance. Bumpy understood that. He knew that the streets weren't just a battleground for money and influence. They were a battleground for pride. And Bumpy's pride wasn't just his own. It was the pride of Harlem. The victory wasn't just his. It was theirs. Luciano, for all his power, had underestimated that. He had thought that the Mafia could simply sweep in and take over, that money and muscle were enough to buy respect. But Bumpy Johnson proved him wrong. Harlem wasn't for sale, and neither was its king. In the months that followed, Bumpy's reputation spread even further. The man who had faced down the most powerful Mafia boss in the city and walked away with his kingdom intact became a legend, not just in Harlem, but in the broader world of organized crime. The Gambino family, along with the other Mafia families, had learned a harsh lesson. Harlem belonged to Bumpy, and anyone who wanted a piece of it would have to reckon with him first. Bumpy's influence only grew from that point. He didn't just control the streets, he controlled the community. He became a leader, a protector, and a symbol of resistance to anyone who thought they could simply come in and take what they wanted. His ties to the people of Harlem were unbreakable, and his legend continued to grow, not because of the fear he inspired, but because of the respect he commanded. For those who lived and worked in Harlem, Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was a king. And like all kings, he had earned his throne not through fear alone, but through the unwavering loyalty of those who had stood by him and the respect he had fought so hard to maintain. The story of Bumpy Johnson's secret deal with Lucky Luciano wasn't just about the clash of two powerful men. It was about the clash of worlds, of cultures, and of the respect that can only be earned, never bought. Bumpy's victory that night was more than just a business win. It was a statement. He didn't just defeat Luciano. He defeated the very idea that power could be taken without consequence. He proved that no matter how large the empire, no matter how deep the pockets, there was always something more important, something that couldn't be bought or bargained for: respect. Bumpy Johnson's legacy was built on more than just his control of Harlem. It was built on his unwavering belief in the dignity of his people. And in a world where many would have bowed to the pressures of power, Bumpy stood tall, reminding the world that true respect can never be taken. It must be earned. This wasn't just about one man's pride. It was about an entire community standing up, united against the forces that sought to strip them of their pride. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world that respect, true respect, is the one thing you can never buy, no matter how much power you have.